Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Have you ever felt trapped in a situation, wondering if there was any way out? Meet Mark Davis. At 23, Mark was a struggling law student, drowning in debt, and carrying the weight of his late father's financial mess. His days were spent juggling textbooks and part-time jobs, but the looming pressure of unpaid bills and looming deadlines never seemed to end. Yet, as the sky above Texas poured rain that cold afternoon, Mark had no idea that a simple meeting would change his life forever. It all started when Mark got a mysterious call. "Mr. Davis, I'd like to meet with you regarding your financial situation," the voice on the other end said. It was Eleanor Brooks, an older, wealthy woman. Mark was confused. Who was she, and how did she know about his debts? She was clear, no small talk. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m., she said before hanging up. Mark barely had time to process it. He had a full schedule ahead, but curiosity gnawed at him. So, drenched by the rain, he stepped into Brooks Bistro, the warm glow from inside offering a stark contrast to the dreary weather outside. When he entered, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries filled the air. The bistro was quiet, with just a few patrons scattered around. Eleanor was already there, seated at a corner table, dressed impeccably in a sharp suit. She looked every bit the part of a woman in control, someone whose wealth and power could only be measured in the millions. "Mark," she greeted him with a small, polite smile, signaling for him to sit. Her piercing blue eyes met his with a level of calm authority that made Mark uncomfortable. "I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're struggling. But I'm here to offer you a solution." Mark's mind raced. What was she talking about? This didn't sound like any kind of business deal he was prepared for. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously, trying to make sense of the situation. With a slow, deliberate motion, Eleanor set down her cup of tea. She studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I'm offering you a way out. Marry me, Mark. This isn't about romance. This is a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts, guarantee your financial security, and in return, you'll become my husband." Mark blinked in disbelief. "What?" he finally managed to stammer, still processing the absurdity of the proposal. He tried to laugh it off, thinking this had to be some kind of joke, but the seriousness in her eyes told him otherwise. "I don't need love, Mark. I need someone who will help me secure my legacy. I have no family, no one to carry my name. I want a companion, someone who will stand by me for appearances, but also someone who will play their part in my life." She leaned in, lowering her voice just slightly. "And you, Mark, fit the bill perfectly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this." Mark didn't know what to say. The proposal was so outrageous, yet Eleanor's confidence left little room for doubt. "Why me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Because you're the only one who's in a position to need it. The rest are too proud. You need the money. You need the security. So, what do you say?" He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was insane, right? Marry a stranger for money? It felt like everything he'd worked for was slipping through his fingers. But what other option did he have? His mind raced through the possibilities. Could he really afford to turn this down? Could he really afford not to? For a long moment, Mark sat in silence. The rain continued to fall outside, tapping against the windows as if waiting for his answer. Eleanor's steady gaze never wavered. And then, Mark did the one thing he thought he wouldn't. He agreed. "I'll do it." That was the beginning of a deal neither of them would ever expect to change their lives as much as it did. Mark's world was about to shift in ways he could never have imagined. The following day, Mark walked into Brooke's bistro again, his mind still reeling from the previous night's unexpected proposal. It wasn't just the absurdity of the offer that had him shaken, it was the weight of the decision he now had to make. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but inside the bistro, the warm, inviting atmosphere remained unchanged. He looked around the familiar surroundings, now with a sense of unease. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but it did little to calm his nerves. He took a deep breath and approached the counter, where Eleanor was waiting for him, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "Mark," Eleanor greeted him as she noticed him approach, her tone steady and unbothered. "I see you made up your mind. Let's discuss the terms." She motioned to the seat across from her, indicating he should sit. Mark sat down, his hands fidgeting nervously with the sleeve of his jacket. The conversation from last night still echoed in his head. It was almost impossible to believe. Marry a woman he barely knew, for money, for security. But what choice did he really have? His debts were mounting, and his future seemed as bleak as the sky outside. He had barely scraped by since his father's death, and this was a way out. "I'm sure you're having second thoughts," Eleanor continued, studying him carefully. "This isn't about love, Mark. It never was. It's about securing your future, and mine. You get to leave all your problems behind, and I get the stability of a husband to help me secure my legacy. We don't have to pretend to fall in love, but we do need to respect the contract." Mark nodded slowly. He couldn't deny that part of him was drawn to the idea. The thought of being free from the crushing weight of debt, of not having to worry about where his next meal would come from, was tempting. But something inside him fought back. He wasn't the kind of person who could easily accept such a deal. Still, there were no other options. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of someone who had been in control for a long time, someone who had never had to second-guess her decisions. "It's simple," she said. "We'll have a quiet ceremony, no fuss. You'll wear the ring, and you'll move into my estate. You'll accompany me to events, handle the family business when necessary. There will be no romance between us, Mark. But there will be an understanding." Mark felt the tension in his shoulders, the knot that had formed deep in his chest. He had always prided himself on being independent, on never relying on anyone for help. But here he was, about to give up his freedom for a chance to escape the mess his life had become. As he sat there, staring into Eleanor's calculating eyes, he realized just how much he was willing to sacrifice. Was he really going to do this? Was he really going to marry a woman he barely knew, just for the sake of security? "You know, you don't have to do this if you don't want to," Eleanor said, almost as if reading his mind. "I'm offering you a way out of all this. A chance to rebuild your life. But if you refuse, then you're back where you started. That's your choice." Mark sat back, his mind swirling. A part of him hated the idea, but another part felt relieved. Eleanor was offering him something he had never dreamed of, a way out. A chance at stability, a future that didn't involve scraping by every day. And yet, the idea of marrying her, someone so different from him, so distant, left a bitter taste in his mouth. "I'll do it," he finally said, the words escaping his lips before he could even process them. The moment he said them, he realized how much he had just signed away. But there was no turning back now. Eleanor's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She stood up, offering her hand to him. "Good. Then it's settled. We'll begin the preparations immediately." Mark shook her hand, his grip firm, but his heart heavy. As he left the bistro that afternoon, the world outside seemed to be spinning faster. The rain had stopped, but a storm was brewing within him. What had he just agreed to? And what was he really getting himself into? He couldn't shake the feeling that this decision, this strange, unexpected marriage, would change everything. But whether it would be for better or for worse, only time would tell. Later that evening, as Mark walked into the grand estate that Eleanor called home, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The mansion was stunning, its high ceilings and marble floors reflecting the wealth and status that Eleanor carried with her. It was a world Mark had never been a part of, and now he was about to live in it. The reality of his decision was beginning to set in. As Eleanor led him through the halls of her home, showing him his new room, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was all wrong. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be someone's husband, especially not for a contract. But what choice did he have? His future was in her hands now. And so, his new life began. Not with love or romance, but with a business deal that would change everything. He had no idea just how much Eleanor's offer would impact his life or what it would lead to, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. Mark woke up early the next morning in the guest room of Eleanor's sprawling estate. The mansion was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. The room was large, decorated with high-end furniture, but Mark felt an overwhelming sense of alienation. This was a life he had never imagined, a life of luxury that came at the cost of his own freedom. He got out of bed, his feet cold against the marble floor, and walked to the window. The sprawling grounds outside were meticulously maintained, a far cry from the cramped apartment he had left behind in the city. He could feel the weight of the decision he had made settling in. He was no longer just a struggling student now, he was a husband in a contract, bound by the promises he had made to Eleanor. The rain from the previous day had stopped, but the gray sky outside matched his mood. He had chosen stability, but at what cost? He was pulled from his thoughts by a soft knock on the door. "Mark?" Eleanor's voice came through, steady as always. "It's time for breakfast. I'll be downstairs in the dining room. Come join me when you're ready." Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded to himself. It was time to face this new life he'd in, to step into the role he had agreed to take on. He had made this choice, after all, and now it was time to live with it. When Mark arrived downstairs, Eleanor was already seated at the long dining table, sipping a cup of coffee. The spread before them was nothing short of extravagant fresh pastries, eggs, bacon, and fruit. But it wasn't the food that caught Mark's attention, it was Eleanor's calm demeanor, as if she were used to this life and the decisions that came with it. Her world was so different from his, and he wasn't sure he could ever fit into it. "I trust you slept well?" Eleanor asked, looking up at him as he sat down. She didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that they were still strangers in every sense of the word. "The room is yours for as long as you need it. I've arranged for a meeting with my lawyer today to go over the details of our agreement, but after that, you're free to do as you please within reason, of course." Mark nodded, trying to focus on the food in front of him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for another meeting with Eleanor's lawyer, but he knew he had no choice. This was the life he had signed up for, after all. As they ate in silence, Mark couldn't help but think about his mother and sister back home. He hadn't told them about the arrangement he had made with Eleanor. How could he? How could he explain that he had agreed to marry a woman he barely knew just to escape his debts? His family would never understand. But he had no other choice. They were barely surviving as it was, and this was his chance to finally give them some stability. After breakfast, Eleanor led Mark to her study, where her lawyer was waiting. The man, a sharp-dressed professional with a no-nonsense attitude, immediately began laying out the terms of the contract. Mark was barely listening, his mind still reeling from the shock of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. As the lawyer spoke about inheritance, business dealings, and legal obligations, Mark felt as if he were drowning in a sea of paperwork. He had thought his life was difficult before, but this was a whole new level of complexity. "Do you understand everything so far?" the lawyer asked, looking up from the contract. His voice was stern, but there was a hint of impatience in it as well. Mark nodded slowly. "I understand." But did he really? Was he really ready for this life, this commitment, this world that seemed so far beyond anything he had ever known? "Good," the lawyer said, as he slid the contract over to Mark. "Sign here, and we'll begin the process immediately." The sooner we finalize this, the sooner you can start settling into your new life. Mark stared at the document in front of him, his pen hovering over the signature line. For a moment, it felt like everything around him had gone quiet, as if time had frozen. This was it. The moment when his future would be decided in a single stroke of a pen. It wasn't just a signature, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another. A life with Eleanor, a life he hadn't chosen, but one he had agreed to live. With a deep breath, Mark signed his name. As the ink dried on the paper, he felt a sense of finality settle in. There was no turning back now. He was committed to this new life, for better or for worse. Eleanor was right. This wasn't about love, it was about survival. Later that evening, as the sun set over the estate, Mark sat in his new office, looking out over the sprawling grounds. He had everything he could have ever wanted: money, security, a place to live, but something was missing. He hadn't expected love, not in this arrangement, but he hadn't expected to feel so empty either. He looked down at the contract again, the weight of it still heavy in his hands. This was his life now. And no matter how much he might wish for things to be different, he couldn't escape the reality of his decision. He let out a sigh, feeling the burden of it all press down on him. This was just the beginning. Mark sat in his new office, the weight of the signed contract still pressing down on him. The walls around him, covered with elegant artwork, felt like they were closing in. Everything in the mansion was beautiful, meticulously designed, yet nothing about it felt like home. It was a life he had never imagined, a life built on a deal rather than love. As he looked out the window at the vast grounds stretching before him, the silence was deafening. He had what most people dreamed of: wealth, stability, security, but at what cost? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Eleanor: "I hope you're settling in. There's a charity gala tonight, and I'd like you to attend with me. We'll need to make a public appearance, so I'll need you to be ready by 6:30. Mark stared at the message, his heart sinking. The charity gala was another reminder of the life he had agreed to join. It wasn't just about playing the role of a husband for show now. He had to walk in the circles of high society, attend fancy events, and smile for the cameras. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that this was what he wanted. He glanced around the office again. This space, designed to look like it belonged to someone important, felt hollow. There were no personal touches, no photographs of his family, no keepsakes from his past. It was as if he had stepped into someone else's life, someone who was far removed from the man he used to be. Mark stood up, running a hand through his hair. He had made a promise to himself that he would never become someone who hid behind wealth and status. But now, it seemed, he was stuck. Eleanor had given him a way out of his crushing debts, and for that, he was grateful. But at the same time, he was drowning in a world that wasn't his. He felt like a stranger in his own life. As the clock ticked closer to 6:30, Mark reluctantly changed into the black tuxedo Eleanor had picked out for him. He hadn't felt like himself in days, but this event was important. Eleanor had already made it clear that he needed to be by her side, playing the role she had envisioned. He wasn't sure how much longer he could continue with the charade, but he had no choice. There was no turning back now. When he stepped into the grand foyer of the estate, Eleanor was waiting for him, dressed in an elegant black gown. She looked every bit the part of a powerful woman who owned everything she touched, and yet, Mark couldn't help but notice the coldness in her eyes. She wasn't looking for a partner, she was looking for someone who would play a role, and Mark had agreed to it. That much was clear. "You look perfect," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and calculated. "I'm sure you'll fit in just fine at the gala. Remember, it's all about appearances. We can handle everything else once we're inside." Mark nodded, though he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was the nerves of the upcoming event or the weight of the decision that still haunted him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being swallowed whole by the life Eleanor had created for them. The ride to the gala was a quiet one. Eleanor didn't speak much, and Mark, lost in his own thoughts, didn't have much to say either. They arrived at the venue, a lavish ballroom filled with the city's elite. Mark stepped out of the car, adjusting his tuxedo, and followed Eleanor into the grand hall. The lights were dimmed, and the air buzzed with the low hum of conversations. The guests were dressed to impress, their laughter and chatter filling the space with an air of exclusivity. As they walked through the crowd, all eyes seemed to turn to them. Eleanor, with her poised elegance, and Mark, standing beside her like a perfect accessory. He felt out of place, a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. He could hear people whispering about them, making judgments, but he didn't care. He was just trying to get through the night. Then, Eleanor turned to him with a slight smile, her voice low enough so only he could hear. "Remember, Mark. This is just the beginning. Play your part well, and everything will fall into place. Do that, and I'll make sure your future is secure." Mark swallowed, trying to focus on the task at hand. It was just a gala. Just another event where he had to smile and nod, where he had to pretend that everything was perfect. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He knew he had made a deal with the devil, and now he had to live with the consequences. As the night went on, Mark found himself growing more and more uncomfortable. He was introduced to more people than he could count, all of them asking questions he didn't have the answers to. He wasn't part of this world. He didn't belong here. And the longer he stood there, the more he realized that he never would. By the end of the evening, as the final toast was made, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. He had done his part, smiled at the right moments, nodded when needed, but the whole time he felt like an actor playing a role in someone else's story. It was a life he never imagined for himself, and now, it was his reality. As they left the gala and made their way back to the estate, Eleanor looked at Mark with a satisfied expression. "See? I told you it would be fine," she said, her voice cold yet assuring. "You're getting the hang of it." Mark didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. His life was no longer his own, and he wasn't sure how to take it back. The days following the gala passed in a blur. Mark spent his time attending events, meeting people who seemed to only care about one thing: status. Eleanor's world was nothing like the life he had known. Everything was polished, perfect, and utterly shallow. He went through the motions, showing up with Eleanor at every function, standing by her side like a piece of elegant decor, but inside, he felt lost. The luxury of his new life never felt like his own. It was as if he were living in someone else's skin. He had signed up for this life, but it never felt real. One evening, after another high-profile dinner party, Mark found himself walking alone through the grand halls of the estate. He had gotten so used to the silence that it no longer startled him. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly alone with his thoughts. As he passed a portrait of Eleanor's late parents, the same cold feeling that had been nagging at him for weeks returned. He felt like he was walking in the footsteps of a legacy he didn't belong to, and the emptiness of his situation was starting to take its toll. When he reached the living room, he found Eleanor sitting by the fireplace, her sharp eyes scanning a set of documents. She looked up as he entered, her lips curling into a smile that seemed rehearsed. She motioned for him to sit across from her. "You're looking distant," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "Is everything all right?" Mark hesitated. He had grown used to the way she spoke, detached, almost calculating, but something about the question made him pause. "I'm fine," he replied, though the words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. He had said it so many times now that he was starting to believe it. Eleanor didn't press him further, but her gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. "Good," she said, turning back to the papers in front of her. "I'm glad to hear that. We have a lot of work ahead, and I need you to be focused. This business is everything. It's the foundation for our future." Mark nodded absently, feeling the weight of her words. He had signed up for this partnership, and he had promised to play his part. But the longer he stayed in this world, the more he felt disconnected from everything he once believed in. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of who he was. Later that night, as Mark lay in his bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He could hear the soft ticking of a clock in the hallway, and the distant hum of the house settling. Eleanor's face, her cold and calculating gaze, haunted him. He had seen glimpses of a different side to her, the vulnerable woman who had no family left, the person who had offered him a way out of his own despair. But he couldn't deny the fact that this arrangement was taking its toll on him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending. He had promised Eleanor that he would play his role, but every day felt like another layer of himself being chipped away. Mark couldn't help but think back to the time before all of this, the days when he was just a law student, struggling but free. He had dreams back then, real dreams that didn't involve contracts or deals. He had wanted to make a difference, to stand on his own 2 feet. Now, all of that seemed so far away, like a different life, a different person. He wasn't sure if he even knew who he was anymore. The next morning, Eleanor was waiting for him at the breakfast table, as always. She was already dressed for the day, her demeanor cool and collected. Mark joined her, but the usual small talk felt forced. There was a distance between them now that hadn't been there before. As they ate, Eleanor spoke about their upcoming plans, but Mark barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the life he had left behind and the life he had agreed to live. The promise he had made to Eleanor seemed to weigh heavier with each passing day. When breakfast ended, Eleanor stood up and placed her hand on Mark's shoulder, a gesture that felt both intimate and businesslike. "You're doing well," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know it's not easy, but remember, everything we've built together is for our future. We're partners in this, Mark." Mark looked up at her, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He wanted to believe in her words, wanted to believe that this was all part of some grand plan. But the truth was, he was no longer sure what he was doing here. Was he really helping her secure her future, or was he just a pawn in her game? As he stood to leave the room, Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Mark," she said, her tone colder now. "Don't forget, you signed up for this. You agreed to play your part. So don't let anything distract you. We have a life to build, and I expect you to help me build it." Mark nodded silently, his chest heavy with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. He had made a choice, but now, he wasn't sure if it was the right one. All he could do was move forward, one step at a time. And as he walked out of the room, the weight of the life he had chosen seemed more suffocating than ever. The next few weeks felt like a blur for Mark. He continued playing his part in Eleanor's world, showing up to every event, every meeting, every dinner, all while feeling more and more like an outsider in his own life. The glamour and luxury that had once seemed so appealing now felt suffocating. Mark had become a fixture in Eleanor's life, but the life they were building together felt like a facade. He was there to play the role of a husband, to stand beside her as the world watched, but in the quiet moments, when no one was around, he was reminded of how little he truly knew her. Eleanor was always focused, always calculating, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that beneath her polished exterior, there was a loneliness that she tried desperately to hide. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Eleanor and Mark were sitting together in the study, reviewing some paperwork. The estate was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional crackling of the fire in the hearth. Mark looked up from the papers in front of him, his mind drifting as he thought about everything that had happened since he signed the contract. He had made a promise to Eleanor to help her build a future, but now, with every passing day, he wondered if this future was what he really wanted. He had once dreamed of something different, something real, but now, those dreams felt so far out of reach. "You're quiet tonight," Eleanor remarked, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Mark could hear the faint hint of concern in her words. "What's on your mind?" Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. He had grown accustomed to keeping his thoughts to himself, to hiding the turmoil he felt inside, but something about the quiet of the room made him feel the need to share his feelings. "I don't know," he said softly. I don't feel like I belong here. I'm doing everything you asked of me, but it feels like I'm losing myself in the process." Eleanor's expression softened, though it was hard to tell if it was genuine concern or simply a calculated reaction. She put down the paperwork and leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Mark," she said after a pause, her tone more serious. You're doing exactly what you need to do. This isn't about you or me, it's about the bigger picture. We're building something together, and sometimes that means making sacrifices. Mark nodded, though he didn't feel reassured. He knew Eleanor was right in one sense. They were building something, but it wasn't the life he had ever imagined. It wasn't the life he had signed up for. He had agreed to help her secure her future, but as each day passed, he found himself questioning what his own future would look like. Would he ever be happy in this life, or had he sacrificed too much of himself to be part of Eleanor's world? Later that night, Mark walked through the estate's vast hallways, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The weight of his thoughts was almost unbearable. He had thought that signing that contract would be the end of his struggle, but now it felt like the beginning of something far more complicated. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or fear or something else entirely, but he felt as though he were drowning in this new life. He longed for something real, something that felt like it belonged to him. He stopped in front of a large window that overlooked the estate's gardens. The moonlight reflected off the perfectly manicured lawns, casting an almost magical glow on everything. But the beauty of the scene didn't offer him any comfort. He realized then that, despite all the wealth and security that came with this life, he had lost something essential: his sense of self. It wasn't just the marriage. It was everything. The decisions he had made, the promises he had kept, had all led him to this moment of emptiness. He had given up so much of himself for this life, but what was he really getting in return? Mark, Eleanor's voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. I've been thinking about our future. I want us to be more involved in the business together. I think it's time we start taking more control. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. More control, he repeated, unsure if he was ready to dive even deeper into the life she had created for them. Was there even room for him in this future? Or was he just a part of the machinery that kept Eleanor's world running smoothly? Yes, Eleanor said, her tone firm. We're in this together, Mark. And I'm counting on you. We can't afford to lose focus now. There's too much at stake. Mark nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing himself more with each passing day. He had promised to stand by her, to help her, but at what point did he stop being just a pawn in her game and start living his own life again? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he couldn't keep pretending. Not forever. The days after Eleanor's proposal for Mark to become more involved in the business felt like a blur. He had spent so much time trying to keep his distance, playing the role of the dutiful husband in public, but now, the lines between his personal life and his responsibilities had blurred even more. Eleanor's demands were becoming more frequent, and she expected him to handle high-stakes meetings, attend social functions, and manage projects he had no interest in. Mark found himself sinking deeper into a life he wasn't sure he was meant to live. He had never imagined that his role would expand beyond what he had already agreed to, but now he was caught up in it, forced to navigate a world of business dealings, contracts, and endless expectations. As time passed, the sense of disconnection from his former life grew stronger. Every night, he would return to the mansion, only to be met with silence and the overwhelming feeling of being trapped in someone else's world. One evening, after another long day of meetings and corporate dinners, Mark sat alone in the living room, his mind racing. He stared at the fireplace, the crackling sound of the wood almost soothing, but the unease in his chest wouldn't fade. Eleanor was out of town for business, leaving him to deal with the aftermath of a crucial negotiation she had been involved in. He had attended the meeting as her partner, but he had felt out of place the entire time. The clients had seen him as a mere accessory, a pawn in their dealings with Eleanor's company. No one cared about his thoughts or ideas. It was clear that his role was just to support her in front of others, to appear like a couple, to appear strong. The truth, however, was that Mark wasn't sure if he was even strong enough to play this part anymore. His phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. Mark, I hope everything is going well with the clients. I need you to handle the presentation tomorrow. We've already discussed it. Mark sighed, looking at the screen. He had no experience with presentations of this magnitude, and yet, he was expected to perform flawlessly. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending he was suited for this life. He had no passion for it, no drive. It felt like he was drowning, and the walls around him were closing in tighter each day. As he sat there, staring at the fire, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Eleanor had returned early from her trip. Mark didn't turn to face her at first, not wanting to hide the frustration that had been growing in him. He had tried to be patient, tried to adjust to the life she had laid out for him, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Eleanor approached him, her heels clicking on the polished floors. "Mark," she said, her voice cool and steady. "We need to talk." He finally turned to face her, his expression weary. "About what?" Eleanor stood in front of him, her posture perfect, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed a hint of impatience. "I'm getting frustrated, Mark. I've been putting in all the effort to make this work, and I don't see the same level of commitment from you. You agreed to this partnership, and I expect you to pull your weight." Mark's heart raced as he stood up, feeling the anger rise within him. "I'm doing everything you asked. I'm playing my part. But don't you see? I'm not part of this world. This is your life, not mine. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep pretending to be something I'm not." Eleanor's gaze softened slightly, but there was no apology in her eyes, only determination. "You knew what you were getting into, Mark. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be strong, to stand by me in this. We're in this together." Mark stared at her, feeling a deep sense of emptiness. Was this really what he wanted? A life built on appearances, on expectations? He had given up so much of himself to be here, and now, it seemed like he was losing the one thing that had kept him going, his own sense of identity. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I don't know who I am anymore." There was a long pause, the weight of Mark's words hanging between them. Eleanor's expression was unreadable, and for a moment, Mark thought she might say something, offer some kind of comfort, but instead, she simply turned away. "You'll figure it out," she said, her voice distant. "You're not the only one struggling. But we don't have the luxury of giving up. We've built this life together, and now we need to make it work." Mark watched as she left the room, the finality of her words sinking in. He had promised to help her build this life, but in doing so, he had lost himself. And now, he was unsure of where to go from here. The man who had walked into this life months ago had already begun to disappear, replaced by someone who was only a shadow of who he once was. Eleanor was right about one thing: couldn't give up. But he wasn't sure if he could keep going like this, pretending to be someone he wasn't. The days that followed felt like a constant battle between Mark's growing sense of isolation and the pressure to keep up with the life he had agreed to lead. Eleanor's expectations only seemed to increase, and with each passing day, Mark found himself slipping further into a role he didn't recognize. He spent hours at the office, helping with presentations, attending meetings, and doing everything she asked, but none of it felt like his own. He was playing a part in Eleanor's world, but every day, he felt less and less like himself. One evening, after another exhausting day, Mark sat in the study, staring at the papers in front of him. He had grown tired of the constant cycle: attend events, make small talk, smile for the cameras, and then retreat into the silence of the mansion when the world outside was done looking. He had hoped that one day, he would find peace in this life, that somehow he would learn to adapt. But instead, he found himself overwhelmed by the emptiness. He had lost sight of his dreams, his goals, and his purpose. As he sat there, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Eleanor. She stepped inside, her expression as composed as always. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice cool and direct. Mark looked up from his desk, his eyes tired. He knew this conversation was coming. It had been building for days, weeks even. "What is it this time?" he asked, his voice more strained than he intended. Eleanor took a seat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "You've been distant lately," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I've noticed it, and I can't ignore it any longer. If we're going to continue with this arrangement, I need you to be all in. No more hesitation, no more doubt. I can't afford to have you pulling away from me. Mark felt his chest tighten. He had heard this before, but now, it seemed different. There was an edge to Eleanor's words that made him feel like a failure. I've been doing everything you've asked, Eleanor. What more do you want from me? He asked, the frustration in his voice barely contained. She didn't flinch. It's not about what I want, Mark, she said calmly. It's about what we both need. You agreed to be my partner in this. And if we're going to make it work, I need you to stop pretending like you're not part of this. You can't keep hiding behind the idea that this isn't your life. It is now. Mark's heart sank as he listened to her words. She was right, in a way. He had signed the contract. He had agreed to this life, to this partnership, but he wasn't sure he was prepared for the emotional cost that came with it. I don't know how to be this person you want me to be, he said quietly, almost to himself. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes softening just slightly. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not, Mark. I'm asking you to step up, to help me build the life we've promised. This isn't just about you and me. It's about something bigger. We have a future to secure, and I need you to stand by me as we do it. Mark looked at her, feeling a wave of emotion he couldn't explain. He had agreed to this, yes, but somewhere along the way, he had lost his sense of self. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, or if he could keep pretending. The man he once was, the one who had dreams and aspirations of his own, seemed so far away now. He didn't know if he was ready to give that up. I know this is hard for you, Eleanor continued, her voice softening even more. But I need you to trust me. Trust that I'm doing this for both of us, for our future. We've already come so far. Don't throw it all away now. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, taking in her words. He had promised to help her. He had promised to be her partner. And in his heart, he knew that she wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. She wanted him to believe in the future they were building together. But what about his own future? Where did he fit into this picture? When he opened his eyes, he finally met Eleanor's gaze. I'm not sure how to do this, he admitted quietly, but I'll try. Eleanor smiled, a look of satisfaction crossing her face. That's all I ask, Mark. I'm not asking you to have all the answers, just to keep moving forward with me. We'll figure it out together. Mark nodded, though doubt still lingered in his chest. He wasn't sure if he could fully embrace the life that Eleanor had laid out for him, but he had made a commitment. He had promised to stand by her, and now, he would have to find a way to do it, not just for her, but for himself as well. And as the days went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his future, their future, was slipping away from him, piece by piece. As the days passed, Mark found himself falling into a strange routine. He had agreed to try, and for the first time since he signed the contract, he felt a small spark of hope. Eleanor's expectations didn't lessen, but something about her calm insistence started to feel less like pressure and more like a commitment to shared responsibility. They worked side by side on projects, made appearances at events, and, for the first time, Mark saw a glimpse of the person behind Eleanor's steely exterior. There were moments, fleeting but real, where he saw vulnerability in her eyes, a reminder that she was also human. Maybe this partnership wasn't as one-sided as he had believed. But even as he grew closer to Eleanor in some ways, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had given up too much of himself. Late at night, when he lay awake in the massive bed of their estate, the quiet was deafening. His thoughts returned to his past life, the life he had walked away from. The dreams he had once nurtured, the freedom he had once had, now seemed like distant memories, like a dream he could never return to. It was one particular evening that things began to change. They had just returned from a high-profile charity event, the kind where the world's most influential people gathered to donate, network, and discuss business. As usual, Mark stood by Eleanor's side, playing the role of the perfect husband, smiling at the right moments, engaging in polite conversation. But inside, he felt numb. When the event ended and they returned to the estate, Eleanor went straight to her study, leaving Mark standing alone in the grand foyer. Mark stood there, looking around at the luxury that surrounded him, the marble floors, the grand staircase, the expensive art adorning the walls. But it all felt so empty. The mansion felt more like a prison than a home. It was then that something inside him snapped. He couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep pretending that he was okay with the life Eleanor had built for them. He had made a promise to her, yes, but what about his own promise to himself? That night, Mark decided to speak up. He found Eleanor in her study, working late as usual. Her back was to him as she typed away on her laptop, but when she heard him enter, she turned slowly, her eyes focused on him with that same calculating gaze she always had. "Mark," she said, her voice calm but tinged with concern. "What is it?" For a moment, Mark didn't know where to begin. The words he had been holding in for so long were finally coming to the surface. "Eleanor," he began, his voice unsteady but growing stronger with each word. I've tried so hard to make this work. But I can't keep doing it. I don't belong here. I'm not the man you want me to be, and I don't think I ever will be." Eleanor didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Mark, I understand that this hasn't been easy for you," she said after a long pause. "But this is our life now. I thought you had accepted that." "I thought I had, too," Mark replied, his voice breaking. "But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I don't know who I am anymore. I've given up everything for this, and I don't know if it was worth it." There was a long silence between them, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something in Eleanor's eyes. Regret? Or maybe understanding. She stood up from behind her desk and walked over to him, her steps slow and deliberate. "I never wanted to lose you, Mark," she said quietly, her voice softening. "But you were never meant to just stand by my side. We were supposed to build something together, not live in the shadow of each other's expectations." Mark looked at her, feeling a rush of emotion that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Maybe this wasn't the end of his journey with Eleanor. Maybe it was just the beginning of something different, a new kind of partnership, one that wasn't built on pretense, but on real understanding. "What do we do now?" Mark asked, his voice steady now, though his heart was racing. Eleanor took a deep breath. "We start over," she said. "Together. We've both been carrying too much for too long. It's time to put down the burdens and build something we can both believe in." Mark nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make this work on his terms. A new chapter in their lives, one where he could still be himself, where they could still be partners, but not at the expense of everything he had once dreamed of. As the night went on, Mark realized that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something better, something more real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future again.